My involvement in the Crossing the Switchblade came about this way. I had done a film that was very successful called The Hoodlum Priest, which I wrote and produced back in 1960 and 61. And then I followed that up with another film called The Confessions of Tom Harris, which was a story of the spiritual awakening of a cruel and sadistic criminal who was also a boxer. And then I played as an actor the part of Norman Vincent Peale in One Man's Way, which was taken from his book, The Power of Positive Thinking. And there was a producer who was famous for doing these films based on experiences of Billy Graham, the famous evangelist. His name was Dick Ross. And when he wanted to do The Cross and the Switchblade, he came to me and he said that he wanted me to write and direct. Although he had directed Billy Graham films, he didn't want a Billy Graham type film. He wanted a more sort of realistic kind of film like The Hoodlum Priest. And so he asked me to write it and direct it and to play the part of David Wilkerson. The book was about David Wilkerson's experience with Nicky Cruz, who was a gang member, and it was an autobiographical book about his experience there. And at first I resisted because I felt after doing 3 very notable films of a religious subject, I didn't want to be known as just a religious filmmaker and as if I were only using the film medium for evangelism. But a friend of mine named Tom Harris, whom I had written and produced the movie about called Confessions of Tom Harris, convinced me that it was such a good dramatic story and it was so worthwhile, so important, sociologically important to the world that I should do it. And I decided to do it, but I said I would not both direct and star in it, that I would either direct or star, and I let Dick Ross choose which he wanted me to do, direct or star in it, and he said, I'd prefer you to direct. So that's what I did, and I got my friend Pat Boone to play the part of David Wilkerson. The casting of The Cross and the Switchblade was one of the most important phases, of course, of the filmmaking. First we had Pat Boone, who, as David Wilkerson, was really espousing his own ideas, even though he was using the words in the script, because his feeling and his religious fervor and his belief in the redemption of human beings was very akin to what David Wilkerson felt. And so we began with a big plus by having Pat Boone. Then we were very fortunate in our casting of the part of Nicky Cruz. After auditioning many, many different actors in New York City, I found this fellow who was himself a gang member, and as a matter of fact had a big scar on his back from a knifing in a gang fight, who'd only done street theater and never done really any professional acting. And his name was Estrada. And I auditioned him, and I just thought he was fabulous in the role. Besides having the perfect romantic kind of physical makeup to be a movie leading man, he was very, very handsome and had a very nice build, muscular guy, and as I said, a real tough kid. And he was fantastic in the auditions, and so we decided to cast him. And then we were very lucky. We got Jackie Giroux to play the leading lady. And one of the most fascinating things about the casting was that I wrote the part of a 14-year-old boy in the script, and the part ended up being played by a 21-year-old girl. As a matter of fact, it was a white boy, and it ended up being played by a 21-year-old black girl. And that happened in this way. I auditioned several young people in their teens for the part, young white boys, and I never found someone that I felt was quite right for the part. And then this this black actor came in, and I wasn't sure, to tell you the truth, whether it was an actor or an actress. It was a black person, and seemed to be anywhere from 15 to 18 years old. And the person auditioned for me, and it was absolutely fabulous. Had me laughing and crying, and it was just knocked me for a loop. And I said, well, this is our Bo. This is the perfect one, the Bo. And the name was Joe Robinson, and it gave me no clue. Was it Joe, J-O-E Robinson, or was it J-O Robinson? So I finally said, excuse me for this impertinent question, but are you a boy or a girl? And she said indignantly, I am a girl. Her name was Joanne Robinson, and she was 21 years old, I believe, at the time. And so she played the part of Bo, and she was one of the great assets of the film. So I think that's a good lesson for directors to always not get too set in your ways and be a little bit flexible in your casting, because you might end up with some wonderful surprises. We didn't have a lot of money to do The Cross and the Switchblade. It was only $600,000, and we had to shoot it all union because Dick Ross, the producer, was signed to the unions. So we couldn't do a non-union, what they call an under-the-hat film. Everything had to be above board and by union scale and so on. And in order to be able to shoot the film within the $600,000 budget, Dick Ross said we had to have absolutely no overtime. Now, it was a funny thing with the union rules in New York City where we shot the film. You had to start either at 8 o'clock in the morning or 8:30 in the morning. You couldn't start earlier or later, which meant that we had to start every day in rush hour. And most of our locations were in rush hour, anywhere from an hour and a half away from the offices where we had our production offices, and that's where everybody's time started. They were on the clock from the time they arrived at the production office. So I only had about 5 or 6 hours of actual shooting every day. And the only reason we were able to do it at that figure and in that time is because we were very well organized. We had a 2-week rehearsal period before we started shooting, and I had all the shots drawn out on what we call a storyboard, and the cinematographer knew, and the assistant director knew exactly what shots we were shooting, where the camera should be, and so on, and all the actors were very well rehearsed beforehand, and that's why we were able to shoot the film and complete it so well with that very, very short production and shooting schedule every day. Many people refer to The Cross and the Switchblade as the miracle film, because they said it was a miracle that it was ever completed at all, because we had such a low budget, $600,000. We were shooting in New York City with a tightly union crew, and other films were having terrible problems shooting in New York. A film called Cotton Goes to Harlem had to shut down production and move off because they were so hassled by street hustlers who would shake them down and say that they could control the crowds if they gave them a certain amount of money and so on. So they had to just absolutely could not complete the film in New York. Well, we went into New York and would have had the same problems and should have had the same problems, but something amazing happened, is the crowds never hassled us. We had people around watching us, including gang members. We had a lot of gang members playing gang members in the film, and we never had any trouble. And I attribute that to several factors. Number one, I think David Wilkerson himself had worked in these areas, in these ghetto areas, and with the gang members, and the word got around that this was Reverend Wilkerson's film, that this is Reverend Dave, and it was the making a movie of his life. So I think even the gang members and the hustlers respected that. And also we had Tommy Harris with us. Tommy Harris is a former, I don't know what you'd call him, you couldn't call him a gangster. He was a fighter and a former criminal who had a spiritual conversion himself. And he was a person that was absolutely fearless. He absolutely had no fear of deaths or injury or anything at all happening to him. So if there was ever a difficult situation and people started to give us some trouble or seemed trouble was going to happen, Tommy Harris would go over and quietly talk to him. Pretty soon the trouble would calm down. And we only had one day where our shooting was interrupted, and that was where some people were picketing a welfare office. And whenever we would start to shoot, they would start to sing and shout to interrupt our shooting. And finally, Pat Boone went over and talked to them and explained to them what we were doing and got them on our side too, and so we didn't have any trouble. So the miracle film, The Cross and the Switchblade, went through the entire shooting schedule as if we had a guardian angel on our shoulder, and that's why we were able to complete the film so well with a budget of $600,000. I think it's an interesting story to know how we cast the gang members in the film. What happened is that Tom Harris went out and to all these ghetto areas, and he went to the real gangs at their headquarters where they're having meetings. And most of the gangs there were either Puerto Rican or they were black gangs. And he would go into these meetings and he'd just walk right in, and he was totally astonished to see this white guy, this hunky, walk into their meetings without any fear at all. So they were just totally flabbergasted. And then he would explain what we were doing. We were doing The Cross and the Switchblade about gangs and so on. And he actually got gang members to play the gang members. Now, this created a wonderful sense of reality for the film, but it created a problem for me as a director. As these guys are used to taking baseball bats and chains and knives and beating the big daylights out of each other. And how am I going to get them to act like they're having a gang war and to stage this gang war without them injuring or killing each other? And I hit upon this idea. I got them together and I said to the guys, look, you guys know what you're doing with the fighting here. And he said, but the problem is if you go and really fight, we'll never finish our film. Now, look at it this way. Playing basketball, you guys have played basketball. Now anybody can tuck the basketball under their arm, stiff arm people, run down and throw the ball into the basket and score as many points as they want. But that's not basketball. Basketball is done under certain rules. You have to dribble, you have to pass. You can only put the ball in the basket under certain conditions. It's the same when we're doing our gang wars. The main condition is each one of you will have a major adversary. And it's up to you to make sure that that adversary of yours finishes the film. It's up to you to make sure that he doesn't get injured, he doesn't get killed or whatever. And if he does get injured, if you hurt him, if you really actually hurt him, then you're done a lousy job and you're thrown out of the game. And you won't appear in this film. You will not be in The Cross and the Switchblade. The only way you can be in The Cross and the Switchblade is if you're looking like you're hurting the guy, but you're actually not hurting the guy. And then we worked out certain technical things, how to throw the punch and react to a punch without getting punched. We had rubber knives, we had rubber sticks, you know, when we got into being really hitting the kids. And the amazing thing is we had all these gang wars through the streets, up the fire escapes, over the roofs of buildings where anybody could have fallen off, and luckily didn't. We had fires going in the alleys where they're fighting through the fires. We had all this, and we had a few black eyes, we had a few bloody noses, we had no broken bones and no injuries, not enough to go to even an emergency ward, much less hospitalizing anybody. And that's how we got the gang wars in The Cross and the Switchblade to look so real without hurting anybody. Well, the whole question of the violence in the film is a very, very tricky one, because we wanted to make a film that showed the reality of the violence between these gangs, but we didn't want to dwell on the violence to the point where it became the focus of the movie and where it became something that was exciting to the audience because of the violence. We wanted the audience to be excited by was the fact of these violent kids coming out of the violence and having their lives reconstituted and having them reconstructed. That was a very, very tricky point to do. And I think the only way that I felt that we could do that is that if the powerful life of David Wilkerson himself was so powerful that it overpowered the violence between the gangs. And that depended a lot on the performance of Pat Boone as David Wilkerson. And also depended on the reality of actually doing the story as David Wilkerson lived it. There had to be nothing phony. It had to be all very real. So I went around to all these areas where the gangs were with David Wilkerson, and I actually talked to a lot of the gang members and even saw some scenes where they were actually shooting up dope and really got into what their lives were actually like. And as a matter of fact, one particularly scary night, we were in a place called, in the South Bronx that was called Fort Apache by the policemen because it was such a dangerous area. The police station was called Fort Apache. And we're going through this dangerous area, and we're seeing these gang members in the street corners at night with David Wilkerson and I. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, am I glad he knows these people. This looks like a pretty tough area to be in at night. A couple of white guys by themselves. And just as I'm thinking that, David Wilkerson says, gosh, it's amazing how these neighborhoods change. I don't know anybody around here anymore. I think, oh my gosh. So what he did is David Wilkerson walks right up to these tough-looking guys that are eyeing us, and he introduces himself. And since they were recent gang members, not ones he knew, they didn't really relate to his name. But he said, hey, you know this guy? This is Don Murray, the guy that played opposite Marilyn Monroe and Bus Stop. So that was sort of our calling card. It wasn't David, but it was the fact that they got this guy that played the cowboy with Marilyn Monroe and Bus Stop, and he was talking to him now. And so that's how we got David Wilkerson was smart enough to get us through those neighborhoods in those days. But anyway, we had the sense of reality through the film, and also Pat Boone's conviction. He really believed the words that Wilkerson was saying because he believed what Wilkerson believed. And his own passion came through as David Wilkerson's passion. And I think that that's what was made the film so powerful, and that the David Wilkerson overpowered the gang fighting with his convictions, and that was because of the convictions of Pat Boone. In the Cross of the Switchblade, we had these gangs, and Redmond Wilkerson throwing himself between these gangs, the black gang, the Puerto Rican gang, and then the white kids, and causing them to stop killing each other, and many of them to devote their life to Christ through experience with Jesus. I think that's the importance of the Cross and Switchblade. I think it goes far beyond being a successful film. I think it's a very, very exciting, stimulating, and important spiritual experience. I'm constantly being stopped by people, for instance, from Teen Challenge, where we'll go out on street corners and evangelize, and they talk about the book and the film, The Cross and the Switchblade, and I feel so privileged to be part of it, and the fact that I was given the opportunity to co-author with James Barnett the script and to direct these wonderful actors, and to know David Wilkerson, and to know the people at Gateway Films who are distributing it now, and Ken Curtis, the head of Gateway. I've been enriched by my association with these people and by my association with this wonderful story of David Wilkerson, Nicky Cruz, The Cross and the Switchblade.